Hello, I'm Suzanne Mayo-Frint of 2130 Partners, a leadership development and education firm. This is a video about our operating principle, be responsible for what gets heard. This and all of our operating principles can be found in our book, Accelerate, High Leverage Leadership for Today's World. So, misunderstandings are a key factor in causing friction and waste in human interactions, and they're much more common than you might think. An important aspect of leadership effectiveness is to be able to get things done through and successfully completed by other people. So your ability to move others into appropriate, timely, and effective action is largely determined by the consequences of your speaking and listening. So when you take ownership of how your communication lands with other people, you will naturally move to clarifying dialogue as a means to move the work, the conversation, and the relationship forward. When you take ownership of your own listening, what you hear, you'll be a much more objective and engaged listener. So the central message of this operating principle, be responsible for what gets heard, is that if you intend to be an effective leader, especially in these times of accelerated change and complexity, then 100% ownership for mutual understanding of the content and context of the conversation is on you. So, our term, self-generated accountability, means that I can be in control of, in any moment that I choose to, my own thinking, listening, and speaking. We're not saying that you can be control or be in charge of other people's way they listen, or their filters, or their interpretation. You can be present, curious, and responsive as to how your communication lands with the other person. So here's one of the pitfalls of the way when we speak it can be misinterpreted. A pitfall of your communication that disconnects other people and sends them to their survival brain where their options are fight, flight, freeze, or appease. One of the ways we speak that sends people there is when we speak from our unproductive emotions. So we speak while we're angry, frustrated, impatient. All of those reactions and emotions are justified and they're fine for you to have those for a short period of time. The issue becomes when you speak through anger, when you speak from frustration. It's a very different phenomena to speak about your frustration than to speak from frustration. To speak about disappointment versus speaking from disappointment. So that's a key attribute of a leader, is to be able to separate my unproductive emotions from my communication about how they impact the project or the situation at hand. So how you listen impacts also how you hear things. That seems like common sense. But this thing about listening is that we listen through filters. So the filter that you have impacts what you can actually hear. And your filter, the way you listen, can either be conscious or unconscious. Most of the time it's unconscious. If you're going to practice self-generated accountability, being responsible for your listening, speaking, and your actions, and if you're going to practice this operating principle, be responsible for what gets heard, you'll take on shifting your filter from something that could be unproductive to something that's productive. We go into this process much more in depth in our exploration listening model. The basics of that are to shift from judgment, past-based I already know, to curiosity and connectedness. So check out that essential notion and module if you'd like more on exploration listening. So how do we know when this operating principle, be responsible for what gets heard, how do we know when it's missing? How do we know when it's in place? Let me give you the contrast. When this operating principle is missing, I justify my unproductive emotions, why I'm feeling this way, and that I use those justifications as a reason to communicate from them. That's not being responsible for what gets heard. When this operating principle is missing, I think others should just figure out how to communicate with me. That's their issue, to figure out how to hear me, how to take what I say, how to figure out that that's just Suzanne. So I expect them to take the majority of the role there. When this operating principle is missing, people often walk away from conversations with me confused or misunderstandings. So those are some of the points to notice, or some of the symptoms when this operating principle is missing. What about when this operating principle is in place, when I'm actually practicing it? what happens then? What are the symptoms, or what do I notice then? What I notice is then I communicate with intention, I encourage questions, and it's much more an interaction than a monologue. When this operating principle is in place, I'm much more direct, less talking around the topic and more talking to it. And since I'm a direct communicator anyway, I notice that when this operating principle is in place, I'm looking at my direct communication and making sure that the context of it is one that considers how the listener might hear this. After all, remember, if it's my job to make sure that mutual understanding, mutual interpretation, that we have mutual understanding, then I'm going to be as interested in the way a person might hear this as I am in the way that I say it. And one way that I know that another way I know that this operating principle is in place is that I've taken any of the hooks or barbs or things that could disconnect people out of my communication. And people feel very comfortable asking me clarifying questions. So those are some of the key ideas around this operating principles. This operating principle, be responsible for what gets heard, some contrast and when it's in place and when it's missing. I'd like to finish by giving you a couple of practice opportunities, a couple of ways for you to put this operating principle into your practice every day. The first practice opportunity is to learn to communicate with a clean and clear intention. So let me tell you what I mean about clean and what I mean about clear. So a clear intention, let me tell you what I mean by a clear intention. It's one that is conscious, and conscious about the content I intend to deliver, and I've considered the listening of the recipient. A clean intention is one where I've really taken out the hooks and the barbs, the insults, the things that could be the innuendos, the insinuations, anything that could hook other people into going down an unproductive track. So this practice opportunity is to listen with a clean and clear intention. Before you go into a conversation, ask yourself these questions. What's my intention? What is the content I want to communicate? How do I want them to hear this? What is the action I'd like them to walk away with? How might my own biases, historical biases, or my own emotions get in my way? How has my language in the past or my way of being in the past been unproductive in this regard? Who might be able to give me input about how my communication has landed with other folks, who's an objective observer? What about the listening of the other person? What historical biases might they have? So if I ask myself those questions, then I can form my clean and clear intention for a conversation. That's a way to practice being responsible for what gets heard. The second practice opportunity for being responsible for what gets heard is in your next meeting or your next conversation. Check for understanding. Particularly in the context of delegation, it's critical to be sure that the information that you delivered, the request that you made, got heard the way that you intended it. We've got a long list of questions in our book around this, how to ask these sorts of questions. The key element is that they're open-ended. So rather than ask, did you get it? Do you understand it? Do you need any clarification? All of those questions could be answered with a yes or no. And if I'm the boss giving a communication to, or giving a direction, or assigning a project to a direct report, asking, did you understand that? Is likely to be answered with a yes, whether they did or not. So learn to ask open-ended questions. Here's a few, and you can find lots more in our book. A few questions are, my intention was to communicate X. Did that come across? What other questions might help, what other information might help clarify this for you? What are some of the first steps you see taking on this initiative? What are some of the resources you think you might need to do this? Let me check your understanding of the scope of this. Let's see if we're on the same page. So there's a number of questions that you can ask that give you feedback from the other person to see if the intensity, the scope, the importance, the enormity, all those things got communicated the way you intended. Another way to make sure you're responsible for what gets heard is just look at the face, the body language in the face of the person that you're communicating to. Did it land the way you intended it to? So there's a couple of practice opportunities. This is a really important operating principle, to be responsible 100% over here for the mutual understanding of the content and the context of the conversation, that it's on me. So, Have fun practicing. Thank you.